I still remember the sound of their laughter echoing through Attorney Johnson's oak-paneled office. 3 sharp bursts of mockery that cut through me like glass. My sister Rachel practically doubled over when the lawyer read aloud that Grandpa Robert had left me exactly $1. One single, crisp dollar bill. The family fortune, the house, the investments, everything else went to her and her children. But that dollar? That was apparently my grandfather's final joke, and my family couldn't contain their amusement. What they didn't know was that 3 hours later, I'd be sitting in that same chair, watching Attorney Johnson slide a thick manila envelope across his mahogany desk with trembling hands. What they couldn't have imagined was that inside that envelope lay documents revealing an offshore account in the Cayman Islands containing $3 million. All mine. Every last penny. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a woman who spent 12 years sacrificing everything for family ended up inheriting a fortune that no one saw coming, and how the cruelest moment of my life became the most liberating. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning frost still clung to the windows of our colonial house on Maple Street when I first understood that love in our family came with conditions. I was 8 years old, sitting at the breakfast table in Cedar Falls, Ohio, watching my mother Margaret fuss over my sister Rachel's perfect pigtails while barely glancing at my tangled hair. Rachel was everything I wasn't. Golden-haired where I was brunette, outgoing where I was quiet, destined for greatness where I was simply expected to be useful. Even then, I could see the invisible scoreboard in my mother's eyes. Rachel earned points for being pretty, for making friends easily, for bringing home straight A's without trying. I earned points differently, by being helpful, by not causing trouble, by making sure everyone else's needs came first. It was a game where the rules were never explained, but the winner was always clear. Grandpa Robert was different. While Mom measured our worth in achievements and appearances, he saw something in me that others missed. Maybe it was the way I'd sit with him for hours in his old leather recliner, reading aloud from his collection of classic novels. Maybe it was how I remembered every story he told about his days running Mitchell Hardware, back when Cedar Falls was small enough that everyone knew your name and your business. Or maybe it was simply that I was the one who stayed close while Rachel chased bigger dreams in bigger cities. When I turned 16, Grandpa Robert gave me something that would become my most treasured possession. A leather-bound journal with my initials embossed in gold on the cover. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell. He pressed it into my hands on a rainy Tuesday evening, his weathered fingers covering mine as he spoke words that would echo in my memory for decades. "Someday, sweetheart, you're going to need to remember who you really are," he said, his blue eyes serious behind wire-rimmed glasses. "When everyone else tries to tell you what you're worth, you'll need something to remind you of the truth." I thought it was just a graduation gift. I had no idea it was prophecy. Rachel graduated valedictorian and left for the University of Colorado 3 weeks later. Her car loaded with designer luggage and dreams of becoming a corporate lawyer. She'd visit for Christmas and Easter, filling the house with stories of sorority parties, internships at prestigious firms, and the successful men she was dating. Mom would hang on every word, her face glowing with vicarious pride. I chose to stay closer to home, enrolling at Cedar Falls Community College to study library science. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt right. I loved books, loved the quiet sanctuary of the library, loved helping people find exactly what they needed. More importantly, staying local meant I could help care for Grandpa Robert, whose arthritis was making it harder for him to manage daily tasks. That decision would define the next 12 years of my life. By the time I was 22, I'd moved into the small apartment above Mitchell Hardware, which Grandpa had converted into a cozy living space. The arrangement worked perfectly. I could help him with the store during busy periods, drive him to doctor appointments, and make sure he ate proper meals instead of surviving on crackers and coffee. Mom lived just 10 minutes away, but always seemed too busy with her bridge club and church committees to do more than drop by occasionally. Rachel visited twice that year, both times with her new boyfriend Brian Stevens, a software engineer from Denver, with perfect teeth and an expensive watch. She'd grown more polished with each visit, her laugh a little too bright, her compliments for my simple life delivered with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. During their second visit, over dinner at Rossetti's Italian restaurant, Rachel announced their engagement. The ring was enormous, a princess-cut diamond that caught the light from every angle. Mom cried happy tears and immediately began planning an elaborate engagement party. Grandpa Robert offered his congratulations and ordered champagne for the table. I smiled and hugged my sister and tried to ignore the tiny voice in my head asking when someone would celebrate me with such enthusiasm. The engagement party was held at the Cedar Falls Country Club 6 months later. Rachel flew in with a guest list of college friends and Denver colleagues, transforming our small-town gathering into something that felt more like a corporate networking event. I helped coordinate everything: the flowers, the catering, the photographer, while Mom basked in the reflected glory of having a daughter marrying into Denver society. That night, standing in the corner watching Rachel hold court in her designer dress, I noticed Grandpa Robert watching me with a sad expression. He made his way over, moving slowly with his walker, and stood beside me in comfortable silence. "You know," he said eventually, "sometimes the most important gifts come disguised as disappointments." I didn't understand what he meant then. I thought he was just trying to make me feel better about being the single sister at the engagement party. It would be years before I realized he was preparing me for something much bigger. Rachel's wedding was a lavish affair in Denver 6 months later. I was the maid of honor, wearing a burgundy dress that washed out my complexion while Rachel glowed in ivory silk and French lace. The ceremony was perfect, the reception elegant, the photographs destined for the society pages of Denver magazines. During the reception, as I watched Rachel dance with Brian to their carefully chosen first song, I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was David Chen, Rachel's college friend who'd driven up from Colorado Springs for the wedding. We'd met briefly during the rehearsal dinner, and I'd been struck by his gentle manner and genuine smile. "Would you like to dance?" he asked, extending his hand. We spent the rest of the evening talking and laughing, discovering a shared love of classic literature and old movies. David was a high school English teacher with dreams of writing the great American novel. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a way of listening that made me feel like the most interesting person in the room. When the wedding ended, David asked for my number. For the first time in years, I felt the flutter of possibility. We began a long-distance relationship that sustained itself on handwritten letters, weekend visits, and hours-long phone conversations. David would drive the 4 hours from Colorado Springs to Cedar Falls once a month, spending weekends helping me care for Grandpa Robert and exploring the quiet corners of our small town. He never complained about the distance or the restrictions my caregiving responsibilities placed on our relationship. After 6 months, he started talking about marriage. After a year, he began looking at teaching positions in Ohio. He was ready to build a life with me, ready to move across state lines for love. That's when Grandpa Robert's health took a serious turn. It started with small things: forgetting to take his medications, leaving the stove on, getting confused about what day it was. The doctor diagnosed early-stage dementia, explaining that Grandpa would need increasing levels of care as the condition progressed. Mom immediately suggested we start looking into nursing homes, citing statistics about the challenges of caring for dementia patients at home. But I couldn't do it. This was the man who'd read me bedtime stories, who'd taught me to drive in the empty parking lot behind his hardware store, who'd believed in me when everyone else saw only a quiet girl with modest dreams. The idea of him spending his final years in an institutional setting, surrounded by strangers, felt like a betrayal of everything he'd given me. I made the decision to move back into the family house to provide full-time care. It meant leaving my apartment, reducing my hours at the library, and putting my relationship with David on hold while I figured out how to manage everything. David was understanding at first. He'd still visit when he could, helping me navigate the challenges of caring for someone whose mind was slowly slipping away. But as months turned into years, and Grandpa's condition worsened, the strain began to show. "Sarah," David said during one of his visits, about 2 years into Grandpa's diagnosis, "I love you, but I can't keep living in limbo. I need to know we have a future together." I wanted to give him that assurance, but the truth was I couldn't see beyond the daily routine of medication schedules, doctor appointments, and the gradual loss of the grandfather I'd known. Grandpa Robert needed me in a way that felt both heartbreaking and sacred. I couldn't abandon him, even for love. David waited another year, making the drive from Colorado Springs every few weeks, bringing flowers and patience and increasingly strained smiles. But eventually, even the most devoted love has its limits. The conversation that ended our relationship took place on a cold February evening in Grandpa's living room. David had driven through a snowstorm to see me, and I could tell from his expression that he'd reached a decision. "I've been offered a position at a private school in Portland," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's exactly the kind of opportunity I've been hoping for." I felt my heart sink, even though I'd seen this coming for months. "That's wonderful," I managed to say. "You should take it." "Come with me," he said, taking my hands. "We can find care for your grandfather here. Your mom could take more responsibility, or you could hire professional help. We could start our life together." For a moment, I let myself imagine it. Waking up in a house that David and I had chosen together, teaching at the local library, writing in the evenings while he graded papers. It was a beautiful dream, and for just a second, it felt possible. Then Grandpa Robert called out from his bedroom, confused and frightened by a dream he couldn't distinguish from reality. I squeezed David's hands and let the dream go. "I can't," I whispered. "I'm sorry, but I can't." David nodded sadly, as if he'd expected that answer. He kissed my forehead, told me he'd always love me, and drove back to Colorado Springs through the storm. 3 months later, I received a wedding invitation. He'd married a fellow teacher named Lisa, a kind-looking woman with warm eyes and no family obligations tying her to the past. I sent a card with a check for $50 and my sincere congratulations. I didn't mention that I cried for 3 days afterward, or that I kept his last letter in my jewelry box for years. Rachel visited occasionally during those early years of Grandpa's illness, usually around holidays or family birthdays. She'd breeze in with expensive gifts and dramatic stories about her law firm, her new house in Denver's Cherry Creek neighborhood, and her struggles with fertility treatments. The visits were always brief. She claimed Brian got anxious being away from work for too long, and the children she eventually had seemed to catch every cold and flu virus known to science, making travel complicated. During one visit, when Grandpa was having a particularly difficult day and had forgotten who she was, Rachel pulled me aside in the kitchen. "Sarah, this is too much for one person," she said, her voice filled with what sounded like genuine concern. "You're sacrificing your entire life for someone who doesn't even recognize you half the time." "He's still Grandpa," I replied, loading his dinner dishes into the dishwasher. "The man who raised us when Dad died. Who paid for your..." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. College education. Who gave you the down payment for your first house? He deserves better than being warehoused somewhere. Rachel sighed, checking her manicured nails against the granite countertop. I understand the sentiment, but be practical. You're 43 years old, Sarah. You have no husband, no children, no savings to speak of. What happens to you when he's gone? The question hung in the air between us like smoke. I'd been asking myself the same thing for years, but hearing it from Rachel felt different, more like an accusation than a concern. "I'll figure it out," I said finally. "Will you?" Rachel's voice took on the precise tone she used in her legal practice, the one that dissected arguments and found their weaknesses. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're using Grandpa's illness as an excuse to avoid building a real life." Her words stung because they contained just enough truth to hurt. I had been hiding, in a way, using caregiving as a shield against the risks and vulnerabilities that came with pursuing my own dreams. But I also knew something Rachel couldn't understand, that caring for Grandpa Robert had given my life a meaning and purpose that felt more real than any career or romance could provide. That night, after Rachel and her family had returned to their hotel, I sat with Grandpa Robert on the front porch swing he'd built 30 years earlier. He was having one of his clearer evenings, his eyes focused and present as we watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "She thinks I'm wasting my life," I said, not needing to explain who I meant. Grandpa Robert was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hand covering mine on the swing's armrest. "Your sister sees value in different things than you do," he said finally. That doesn't make either of you wrong, just different. Sometimes I wonder if she's right, though. Maybe I am hiding here. Maybe, he agreed, surprising me. But maybe hiding isn't always about fear. Sometimes it's about waiting for the right moment, or protecting something precious until it's time to reveal it. He looked at me with eyes that seemed suddenly sharp and knowing, as if the fog of dementia had lifted just long enough for him to deliver a message. Some gifts can't be appreciated until people are ready to receive them, he continued. And some people never become ready. The key is knowing the difference. I didn't understand what he meant, but something in his tone made me store the words away for later examination. That conversation would replay in my memory many times over the coming years, especially during the moments when caring for him felt like an impossible burden. As Grandpa's condition progressed, those moments came more frequently. There were nights when he'd wander the house looking for his long-dead wife, mornings when he'd forget how to use a fork, afternoons when he'd become agitated and aggressive over imagined threats. I learned to function on 4 hours of sleep, to remain calm during his episodes, to find small joys in the brief windows when he was fully present. Mom helped when she could, but her assistance came with a steady stream of suggestions about professional care facilities and criticism about my stubborn refusal to be realistic. Rachel's visits became even less frequent after her second child was born, and when she did come, she spent most of her time on work calls or managing her children's various needs. During Grandpa's final 2 years, I essentially disappeared from any life outside our house on Maple Street. I quit my job at the library when his care became too demanding for part-time work. I stopped attending church when he could no longer be left alone. I declined invitations to weddings, baby showers, and high school reunions because I couldn't guarantee I'd be available. The isolation was profound, but it was also strangely peaceful. In caring for Grandpa Robert, I discovered a patience and strength I hadn't known I possessed. I learned to find meaning in small victories, a day when he remembered my name, a meal he enjoyed, an afternoon when we could sit together and listen to his favorite classical music without confusion or fear. People in town called me a saint, but I didn't feel saintly. I felt tired and sometimes resentful, and occasionally desperate for just one full night of uninterrupted sleep. But I also felt purposeful in a way I'd never experienced before. Every day brought challenges, but they were challenges that mattered. Caring for someone who had shaped my life in countless ways. Grandpa Robert died on a Tuesday morning in early spring, just as the dogwood tree outside his bedroom window was beginning to bloom. It was peaceful. He simply didn't wake up from his afternoon nap. I found him an hour later when I went to check on him, his face serene and finally free from the confusion that had clouded his final years. I sat with him for a long time before calling anyone, holding his still warm hand and thanking him for everything he'd given me. Then I called Mom, who arrived within 20 minutes. Then Rachel, who booked the first available flight from Denver. The funeral was everything Grandpa Robert would have wanted. Simple, dignified, and filled with people whose lives he'd touched during his 87 years. Rachel delivered a beautiful eulogy about his business legacy and dedication to family. I chose to remain silent, knowing that my relationship with him had been lived in quiet moments that didn't translate well to public speeches. After the service, as neighbors and friends shared memories over coffee and cake in the church fellowship hall, I felt a strange sense of completion. I had kept my promise to him, had ensured he died surrounded by love and dignity. Whatever came next in my life, I would always have that certainty. 3 weeks later, Attorney Johnson called to schedule the will reading. The morning of the will reading arrived with an unseasonable chill that made me pull my cardigan tighter as I walked up the steps to Johnson & Associates. The law office occupied a converted Victorian mansion on 3rd Street, its burgundy brick exterior and white trim speaking to Cedar Falls' more prosperous past. I'd driven by this building countless times over the years but never had reason to enter until now. Rachel's rental car was already parked in the circular drive when I arrived. A sleek silver sedan that looked out of place among the pickup trucks and aging Buicks that typically lined our downtown streets. Through the tall windows, I could see her pacing in the reception area, cell phone pressed to her ear, gesturing animatedly as she spoke to someone about quarterly projections and client deadlines. She looked every inch the successful Denver attorney in her charcoal gray suit and Italian leather briefcase. Her blonde hair was styled in the kind of precise bob that required weekly salon appointments, and her makeup was flawless despite the early morning flight. Standing there in my simple black dress and modest pumps, I felt like a small-town librarian attending a corporate board meeting. Attorney Johnson greeted us in the reception area, a tall man in his 60s with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair that suggested wisdom earned through years of delivering both welcome and unwelcome news. His handshake was firm but gentle, and when he looked at me, I sensed genuine sympathy in his expression. "Miss Mitchell," he said, "please accept my condolences on your grandfather's passing. Robert was a pillar of this community, and his loss is felt by many." "Thank you," I replied, appreciating that his words felt sincere rather than perfunctory. Rachel ended her phone call with a dramatic sigh and approached us, her heels clicking against the polished hardwood floors. "Mr. Johnson, I'm sorry to keep you waiting. Conference call with Tokyo that couldn't be postponed." She embraced me briefly, her perfume a cloud of expensive florals that made me think of hotel lobbies and first-class lounges. "How are you holding up?" she asked, though her eyes were already scanning the room, taking inventory of the antique furniture and oil paintings that decorated the space. "I'm managing," I said, which was my standard response to that question. The truth was more complicated. I felt simultaneously grief-stricken and relieved, exhausted and strangely energized, lost and liberated all at once. But those weren't feelings that translated well to small talk. Mom arrived 10 minutes later in a flurry of nervous energy, her purse clutched tightly to her chest as if it contained state secrets. She'd dressed for the occasion in her best navy blue suit, the one she wore to church on Easter and Christmas, and had applied her makeup with extra care. Her silver hair was freshly styled, and she wore the pearl earrings Grandpa Robert had given her for her 50th birthday. "I hope I'm not late," she said breathlessly, though she was actually 5 minutes early. The traffic on Elm Street was terrible. They're repaving again, and you know how that creates bottlenecks. Attorney Johnson assured her that she was perfectly punctual and led us into his private office, a spacious room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a massive mahogany desk that dominated the center of the space. 2 leather chairs faced the desk, with a smaller chair positioned slightly behind them. The arrangement felt formal and intimidating, like a tribunal preparing to deliver judgment. "Please, make yourselves comfortable," Johnson said, settling into his chair and opening a thick manila folder. "Before we begin, I want you to know that your grandfather was very specific about his wishes. He spent considerable time ensuring that every detail was precisely as he wanted it." Rachel crossed her legs and opened her briefcase, pulling out a yellow legal pad as if she were preparing to take depositions. "Mr. Johnson, if I may ask, when was this will executed?" "My grandfather's mental state in his final years was somewhat compromised, and I want to ensure that any legal documents were signed while he maintained full capacity." I felt a flash of anger at her implication, but Attorney Johnson's expression remained professionally neutral. "The will was executed 18 months ago, during a period when your grandfather's physician had declared him fully competent to make legal decisions. I can provide medical documentation to that effect if necessary." "That won't be required," Mom interjected quickly, shooting Rachel a warning look. "We're here to honor Robert's wishes, not question them." Johnson nodded and began reading in the measured cadence that lawyers use when delivering formal pronouncements. The language was dense with legal terminology, but the essential meaning became clear quickly enough. The house on Maple Street, along with its contents and the adjacent property where the old hardware store stood, would go to Rachel and her children. The investment accounts, including the substantial portfolio Grandpa had built over decades of careful saving, would also pass to Rachel. My mother would receive a monthly stipend for life, ensuring her comfort and independence. Various charitable organizations would benefit from modest bequests: the Cedar Falls Library, the First Presbyterian Church, the local animal shelter where Grandpa had volunteered every Saturday for 10 years. And then came my inheritance. "To my granddaughter Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell," Johnson read, his voice taking on a slightly different tone, "who has given 12 years of her life to ensure my comfort and dignity, I leave the sum of $1. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt the blood drain from my face as the words registered. $1. After 12 years of round-the-clock care, after sacrificing my career and my relationship, and any chance at building my own life, I was being valued at exactly $1. Rachel's reaction was immediate and devastating. She burst into laughter, a sharp sound that echoed off the office walls like breaking glass. $1? She gasped between giggles. Grandpa left Sarah $1? That's actually hilarious. Mom's face had gone pale, but she made no move to stop Rachel's laughter. Instead, she reached over and patted my hand with a gesture that felt more patronizing than comforting. "Oh, sweetheart," she said in the tone one might use with a disappointed child. "Surely you understand what this means. Your grandfather knew you'd already received your inheritance. You had 12 years with him. That was your gift." The laughter continued, and I felt something fracture inside my chest. Not my heart, that had been breaking slowly for years. This was something deeper, some fundamental belief about family and loyalty and the value of sacrifice. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, and let the sound wash over me like cold rain. "I'm sorry," Rachel said, attempting to compose herself but still struggling with residual giggles. "It's just so perfectly Grandpa. Always the joker. Remember how he used to hide pennies in our Easter eggs instead of candy? This is exactly his sense of humor." Attorney Johnson cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the family dynamics playing out in his office. "There are a few administrative matters to discuss regarding the estate transfer," he said, attempting to restore some dignity to the proceedings. But Rachel was still caught up in her amusement. "Sarah, you have to admit this is funny. All those years you spent playing nurse, and he leaves you enough to buy a candy bar. Maybe he was trying to tell you something about the value of your services." The cruelty of her words hit me like physical blows. This wasn't just about money. It was about recognition, about mattering, about being seen as something more than free labor. I had given Grandpa Robert everything, had held his hand through his darkest moments, had been the last face he saw in life. And apparently that devotion was worth exactly $1. Mom's response was almost worse than Rachel's laughter. "Now, Rachel, don't be mean," she said mildly. "Sarah chose to take care of your grandfather. No one forced her. She made her bed, and now she has to lie in it." The phrase hung in the air like an indictment. I made my bed, as if choosing to care for a sick family member was some kind of character flaw, some poor life decision that deserved its inevitable consequences. Johnson finished reading the administrative details, explaining the timeline for probate and the procedures for transferring assets. Rachel asked several pointed questions about tax implications and real estate valuations, her legal training kicking in as she calculated the monetary value of her inheritance. The house alone was worth at least $300,000, and the investment accounts added another $500,000 to her windfall. Through it all, I sat in silence, my $1 inheritance feeling like a weight in my chest. I thought about all the nights I'd sat up with Grandpa when he couldn't sleep, all the times I'd coaxed him to eat when his appetite disappeared, all the small indignities I'd helped him navigate with as much grace as possible. Apparently, those moments of tenderness and care had been worth exactly 99 cents less than a cup of coffee. When the formal reading concluded, Rachel immediately began discussing practical matters. "Sarah, I assume you'll want to move out of the house fairly quickly. I'm thinking we should put it on the market within the next few months. The spring market is always strong, and I'd rather not carry the mortgage through another winter." The casual assumption that I would simply pack up and disappear stung almost as much as the will itself. This had been my home for over a decade, the place where I'd learned to navigate the complexities of caregiving, where I'd found meaning and purpose even in the midst of sacrifice. To Rachel, it was simply a piece of real estate to be liquidated. "Where exactly am I supposed to go?" I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Rachel shrugged, already mentally calculating property values and closing costs. "I don't know. Get an apartment somewhere. You're only 48, Sarah. You have plenty of time to figure out a new life. Maybe this is exactly the push you need to finally do something with yourself." The condescension in her tone was breathtaking, as if my 12 years of service had been a form of elaborate procrastination, a way of avoiding real responsibility rather than accepting the most profound responsibility imaginable. Mom nodded in agreement. "Rachel's right, dear. This could be a blessing in disguise. You've been stuck in that house for so long, maybe it's time for a fresh start." You could get a little apartment near the library, maybe even date again. Remember David Chen? Such a nice young man. I wonder if he's still single. The suggestion that I might reconnect with the man whose heart I'd broken over a decade ago was so absurd that I almost laughed. Almost. But the sound died in my throat as I realized how completely my family misunderstood both my sacrifice and its consequences. As we prepared to leave the office, Attorney Johnson handed each of us copies of the relevant documents. My folder was noticeably thinner than the others, containing only the basic will and a single page outlining my $1 bequest. Rachel's folder was thick with property deeds, investment account summaries, and tax documents. "Miss Mitchell," Johnson said as I stood to leave, "might I speak with you privately for a moment?" Rachel and Mom were already heading toward the reception area, discussing dinner plans and Rachel's flight schedule for the following day. They didn't notice when Johnson gestured for me to remain behind. "I wanted you to know," he said quietly, "that your grandfather spoke about you often during our meetings. He was immensely proud of the care you provided, and he wanted you to understand that this arrangement wasn't a reflection of his feelings for you." I appreciated his attempt at kindness, but it felt hollow in light of what had just transpired. "Then why?" I asked simply. Johnson hesitated, clearly weighing his words carefully. "Your grandfather was a complicated man with strong opinions about fairness and justice. He believed that some gifts are more valuable than money, and that true wealth isn't always reflected in bank account balances." The explanation felt like philosophical nonsense, designed to make me feel better about being essentially disinherited. I thanked him for his time and walked out to the parking lot, where Rachel and Mom were still deep in conversation about estate logistics. The drive home was a blur of familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign. I passed the library, where I'd once dreamed of building a career, the restaurant where David had proposed a life together, the church where I'd sat through countless services believing that sacrifice and service were their own rewards. Everything looked the same, but I felt like I was seeing it all through different eyes. Back at the house, Rachel's house now, I walked through rooms that held 12 years of memories. The bedroom where Grandpa had spent his final months. The kitchen where I'd prepared thousands of meals adapted to his changing dietary needs. The living room where we'd watched old movies together on afternoons, when his confusion made conversation impossible. All of it belonged to someone else now. All of it had been transferred to a woman who'd visited perhaps 20 times in 12 years, who'd contributed phone calls and greeting cards and occasional guilt money for household expenses. The injustice of it felt crushing, but even worse was the growing realization that this outcome shouldn't have surprised me. I'd been invisible for so long that I'd forgotten I was supposed to matter. That evening, as I sat in Grandpa's old recliner trying to process what had happened, I found myself thinking about the leather journal he'd given me so many years ago. I retrieved it from my bedroom and opened it for the first time in months, reading through entries I'd written during the most difficult periods of his illness. The pages documented not just the progression of his disease, but my own transformation from a woman with modest dreams to someone who'd found unexpected strength in the face of impossible challenges. I'd recorded small victories and crushing setbacks, moments of profound connection and periods of desperate loneliness. The journal was a chronicle of love in its most demanding form, love that asked for everything and promised nothing in return. Reading those entries, I realized that Rachel and Mom were wrong about one thing. I hadn't been hiding from life by caring for Grandpa Robert. I'd been living it more fully than I ever had before or since. The question now was what came next, and whether I had the courage to build something meaningful from the wreckage of my expectations. The phone rang around 9 o'clock, startling me from my reverie. The caller ID showed Attorney Johnson's office number, which seemed odd given the late hour. "Miss Mitchell?" "This is James Johnson. I apologize for calling so late, but I wanted to catch you before you made any major decisions about your living situation." His voice sounded different over the phone, less formal and more personal. "I'm not sure I understand," I said. "Could you come to my office tomorrow morning? There's something your grandfather asked me to discuss with you privately, but only after the official will reading had been completed." My heart started beating faster. "What kind of something?" "I'd prefer to explain in person if you don't mind. Would 10 o'clock work for you?" I agreed to the meeting, though I spent the rest of the evening wondering what additional disappointment might be waiting for me. Perhaps Grandpa had left specific instructions about how quickly I needed to vacate the house, or maybe there were debts I'd be expected to help cover, despite my $1 inheritance. Sleep came fitfully that night, filled with dreams of packing boxes and empty apartments, and the sound of Rachel's laughter echoing through vast, empty spaces. I woke feeling more exhausted than when I'd gone to bed, but also strangely expectant, as if some part of me understood that my story wasn't finished yet. The morning brought unseasonable warmth that felt like a promise of spring's eventual arrival. I dressed carefully in my best blue dress and the pearls Grandpa had given me for my college graduation, wanting to present myself with whatever dignity I could muster. Whatever Johnson had to tell me, I would face it with the same quiet strength that had carried me through 12 years of caregiving. As I drove toward downtown Cedar Falls, I found myself thinking about that conversation on the front porch swing, when Grandpa had talked about gifts that couldn't be appreciated until people were ready to receive them. At the time, his words had seemed like the confused rambling of a man whose mind was beginning to fail. Now I wondered if they'd been something else entirely. The Victorian mansion that housed Johnson and Associates looked different in the morning light, less imposing and more welcoming. The same burgundy brick and white trim, but somehow infused with possibility rather than dread. I parked in the same spot I'd occupied the day before and walked up the familiar steps, my heart pounding with anticipation and fear in equal measure. Whatever waited for me behind those doors, I was about to discover that my grandfather's sense of justice ran deeper than anyone had imagined, and that sometimes the most valuable gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Attorney Johnson was waiting for me in the reception area when I arrived, his usual professional composure replaced by something that looked almost like nervous excitement. He guided me past his formal office to a smaller, more intimate conference room I hadn't seen during yesterday's proceedings. The space felt warmer somehow, with softer lighting and comfortable chairs arranged around a circular table rather than the imposing desk setup from the day before. "Miss Mitchell, thank you for coming," he said, closing the door behind us with deliberate care. "What I'm about to share with you was something your grandfather insisted remain completely confidential until after the formal will reading. He was very specific about the timing and the circumstances." I settled into one of the cushioned chairs, my hands folded tightly in my lap to keep them from trembling. After yesterday's devastating revelation, I wasn't sure my emotional reserves could handle another surprise, regardless of its nature. Johnson took the seat across from me and opened a different folder than the one he'd used yesterday, this one secured with a red ribbon that suggested unusual importance. His fingers moved carefully as he untied the binding, as if he were unwrapping something precious and fragile. "Your grandfather came to me about 2 years ago with what he called his insurance policy," Johnson began, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing a closely guarded secret. "He was very concerned about how your family dynamics might play out after his death, and he wanted to ensure that justice would ultimately prevail." The word justice hung in the air between us, and I felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. "I'm not sure I understand," I said carefully. Johnson pulled a thick document from the folder, its pages marked with official seals and signatures that spoke to legal authenticity. "This is a secondary trust document, one that was never mentioned in the formal will. Your grandfather established it specifically for you, funded through a series of careful financial arrangements that took him nearly 3 decades to complete." My heart began to beat faster as he spread the papers across the table. The letterhead read Cayman International Banking Services, and I could see columns of numbers that seemed impossibly large, even from my upside-down perspective. "Robert was more financially sophisticated than most people realized," Johnson continued. "When he sold his hardware store 15 years ago, he didn't just invest the proceeds in local stocks and bonds. He worked with international financial advisors to create a complex but completely legal offshore investment strategy. He turned the document so I could read it properly, and the numbers came into focus with startling clarity. Account balances, investment growth charts, and transaction histories that painted a picture of careful, methodical wealth accumulation over decades. The total current value of this account is $2,347,612. Johnson said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. Every penny of it belongs to you. The room seemed to tilt around me. I stared at the papers, trying to process what I was seeing, but the numbers felt abstract and impossible. $2.3 million. More money than I'd ever imagined having, more than enough to transform every aspect of my life. But how? I whispered, my voice barely audible. How is this possible? Johnson smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since this whole process began. Your grandfather was playing a very long game, Miss Mitchell. He wanted to see how your family would treat you when they believed you had nothing. He wanted to know if their love was conditional on your usefulness, or if it was real and unconditional. The implications of what he was saying began to sink in. You mean he knew? He knew they would react the way they did? He suspected, Johnson replied carefully. He'd been watching family dynamics for years, noting patterns of behavior and favoritism. The $1 bequest wasn't meant to hurt you. It was meant to reveal the true character of the people around you. I thought about Rachel's laughter, about Mom's dismissive explanation, about the casual cruelty with which they'd discussed my future, as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be valued. Yesterday's humiliation took on an entirely different meaning when viewed through this new lens. He was testing them, I said slowly, the pieces of his plan beginning to fall into place. And they failed spectacularly, Johnson confirmed. Your grandfather included specific provisions in this trust that were triggered by the family's reaction to the will reading. If they had shown you kindness, respect, or gratitude for your years of service, the distribution of this money would have been different. But their behavior yesterday activated clauses that ensure you receive everything. He pulled out another document, this one bearing yesterday's date. I was required to document their exact words and reactions during the will reading. Every laugh, every dismissive comment, every cruel assumption was recorded and witnessed. Your grandfather's instructions were clear. If they proved themselves unworthy of your loyalty, you would be rewarded for your faithfulness. The revelation was staggering in its complexity and foresight. While I'd been focused on daily caregiving routines, Grandpa Robert had been orchestrating an elaborate test of family character that spanned years. Every investment decision, every careful financial move had been part of a larger plan to ensure justice for the granddaughter who'd sacrificed everything for his comfort. There's more, Johnson said, pulling out yet another set of documents. The trust includes specific instructions for how this revelation should be handled. Your grandfather wanted you to have choices about whether and when to inform your family about this inheritance. He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Grandpa's familiar handwriting. He wrote this letter for you to read after learning about the trust. It explains his reasoning and his hopes for your future. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope and unfolded several pages of lined paper covered in the careful script I remembered from birthday cards and grocery lists. Even in his final years, when his mind was failing in so many other ways, his handwriting had remained steady and precise. My dearest Sarah, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means that my suspicions about our family were unfortunately correct. By now you know that your 12 years of devotion were valued at exactly $1 by the people who should have treasured your sacrifice above all else. I had to pause in my reading as tears blurred my vision. Seeing his words, feeling his presence through the familiar cadence of his thoughts, brought back the grief I'd been suppressing since his death. I want you to know that every moment of care you provided was precious to me, the letter continued. Every meal you prepared with such patience. Every night you sat up when I was confused and frightened. Every small kindness you showed when I could no longer remember your name. All of it mattered more than I could ever express while I was alive. The letter went on to explain his financial strategy in more detail. How he'd begun setting aside money for me shortly after I moved in to care for him. How he'd researched offshore banking laws and investment opportunities, working with discreet financial advisors to build a nest egg that would ensure my security long after he was gone. I chose the offshore account not to hide money from taxes. Everything is completely legal and properly reported, but to hide it from family members who might feel entitled to influence how it was used. This money is yours and yours alone, to be spent or saved or given away as you see fit. No one else has any claim to it or any right to even know about it unless you choose to tell them. But perhaps the most powerful part of the letter dealt with his reasoning for the elaborate deception. I needed to know whether the family that claimed to love you would support you when you had nothing to offer them in return. I needed to see if Rachel's affection was genuine or merely convenient, if your mother's appreciation was real or simply based on the free labor you provided. Yesterday's will reading was not about money. It was about character, and I'm sorry to say that the results were exactly what I feared they would be. He went on to describe his hopes for my future, his belief that I had been too good and too generous for too long, and his desire that this inheritance would give me the freedom to pursue dreams I'd set aside in service to others. You have spent 12 years proving that love doesn't require reciprocity, he wrote. Now I want you to spend the next 12 years discovering what it feels like to be truly free. The letter concluded with specific instructions about the trust management and access to the funds, along with contact information for the international banking team that had been administering the account. Everything had been arranged to ensure the smoothest possible transition, with no waiting periods or bureaucratic delays. There's one final element to your grandfather's plan, Johnson said as I finished reading. He left detailed instructions about how you might choose to reveal this information to your family, if you decide to do so at all. He was very specific that the choice should be entirely yours. He handed me a final document, this one outlining several scenarios for disclosure, along with their potential legal and personal implications. Grandpa had thought through everything, from the tax consequences of sudden wealth, to the family dynamics that might result from such a dramatic reversal of fortune. Reading through his meticulously planned options, I realized that my grandfather had understood something about human nature that I was only now beginning to grasp. He'd known that people reveal their true selves when they believe someone has nothing left to offer them. Yesterday's cruelty hadn't been an aberration, it had been an honest expression of how my family really saw me. How long did he work on this plan? I asked Johnson, still struggling to comprehend the scope of what had been arranged. Nearly 3 years of detailed planning, but the philosophical foundation goes back much further. He started making notes about family dynamics and fair inheritance distribution not long after you moved in to care for him. He was very troubled by what he saw as a pattern of taking your service for granted while celebrating your sister's achievements. Johnson paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. Your grandfather was a man who believed deeply in justice, Miss Mitchell. He couldn't bear the thought of your sacrifice going unrecognized and unrewarded. This trust was his way of ensuring that virtue would ultimately triumph over selfishness. The weight of Grandpa's love and foresight was overwhelming. While I'd been focused on daily care tasks, he'd been working to secure my future with the same methodical attention he'd once brought to running his hardware store. Every medical appointment I'd driven him to, every confused night I'd sat with him, every small act of service had been witnessed and valued by someone who understood their true worth. What happens now? I asked, my voice stronger than it had been since entering the office. Johnson smiled and began gathering the documents into a neat pile. Now you have decisions to make. The trust can be accessed immediately. In fact, your grandfather insisted that you have cash available within 24 hours of this meeting. He wanted to ensure you could make independent choices about your living situation and your future without being constrained by financial concerns. He handed me a business card for Patricia Hendricks, the trust administrator who would help me navigate the practical aspects of managing significant wealth. Ms. Hendricks has been expecting your call. She's arranged for immediate access to funds as well as longer-term investment guidance if you choose to use it. As we concluded the meeting, Johnson offered one final piece of information that felt like the capstone to Grandpa's elaborate plan. Your grandfather asked me to give you this, he said, pulling a small wrapped package from his desk drawer. He said you would understand its significance. I unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a simple keychain with a single brass key attached. The key was old and worn, clearly well used, and it took me a moment to recognize what it unlocked. It was the key to Mitchell Hardware, the store where Grandpa had built his fortune through decades of honest work and community service. The building that now sat empty next to the family house. The place where he'd taught me about integrity and perseverance through countless childhood visits. A note was attached to the keychain in his familiar handwriting. For when you're ready to build something of your own. Walking out of Johnson's office, I felt like I was stepping into an entirely different life. The same Cedar Falls streets stretched out before me, but I was no longer the disinherited granddaughter with nowhere to go and nothing to offer. I was a woman of independent means with choices I'd never imagined possible. The first call I made was to Patricia Hendricks, who confirmed that $50,000 could be transferred to my checking account that afternoon, with full access to the remaining funds available within the week. The second call was to the Cedar Falls Inn, where I reserved a suite for an extended stay while I figured out my next moves. I didn't call Rachel to tell her I wouldn't be moving out of the house immediately. I didn't call Mom to explain where I was going. For the first time in 12 years, I made decisions based entirely on my own needs and desires, without considering how they might inconvenience or disappoint anyone else. That evening, sitting in my comfortable hotel suite with room service dinner and a view of the town where I'd spent my entire life, I opened Grandpa's journal one more time. But instead of reading old entries about his illness and my sacrifice, I turned to a blank page and began writing about the future. For the first time in years, the possibilities felt endless. The call came 3 days later, just as I was signing the lease papers for a charming craftsman house on the other side of Cedar Falls. Rachel's name flashed on my phone screen with the same urgency that had once made me drop everything to answer her summons. This time, I let it ring through to voicemail while I continued reviewing the rental agreement for the furnished home that would serve as my temporary residence while I decided what to do next. The house was everything the family home on Maple Street wasn't: bright, airy, and completely free of memories that belonged to other people. Floor-to-ceiling windows filled every room with natural light, and the previous tenant had left behind a collection of thriving houseplants that made the space feel alive and welcoming. For the first time in over a decade, I was choosing where to live based on what brought me joy rather than what others needed from me. Rachel's voicemail was predictably frantic. "Sarah, where are you? I've been calling for days. The house is empty, your stuff is gone, and Mrs. Henderson next door said she saw you loading boxes into a moving truck. What's going on? Call me back immediately." The panic in her voice might have once sent me scrambling to reassure her, but now it simply confirmed what I'd already suspected. My sudden absence wasn't troubling because she missed me. It was troubling because it disrupted her plans to quickly liquidate Grandpa's property and return to her life in Denver. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the expensive machine I'd purchased that morning and sat down at the kitchen island to return her call. It was time for the conversation I'd been rehearsing for 3 days, ever since I'd made the decision about how much of the truth to reveal. "Rachel," I said when she answered on the first ring, "you wanted to talk." "Sarah, what the hell is going on? You disappeared without saying anything to anyone." "Mom is worried sick, and I've got a realtor coming to assess the house tomorrow. You can't just vanish like this." I took a sip of my coffee and watched a cardinal land on the bird feeder outside my new kitchen window. "I found a place to live. I assumed you'd be happy that I'm out of your way." "That's not the point," Rachel snapped, her attorney voice emerging as it always did when she felt her control slipping. "You could have at least told us where you were going. What if there had been an emergency? What if we'd needed to reach you?" The assumption that I would always be available for whatever emergency or inconvenience might arise was so ingrained in her thinking that she couldn't even hear how entitled she sounded. "What kind of emergency were you anticipating, Rachel? Grandpa is gone. The will has been read. You got everything you wanted." "That's not fair," she said, though her tone suggested she knew exactly how fair it was. "Look, I know you're upset about the inheritance, but you have to understand Grandpa's reasoning. You don't have children to provide for, you don't have a mortgage or college funds to worry about. The money can do more good for my family than it could for just one person." The casual dismissal of my life and future was breathtaking in its selfishness, but it no longer had the power to wound me. If anything, it reinforced the wisdom of Grandpa's plan. Rachel truly believed that her needs mattered more than mine, that her family deserved wealth while I deserved whatever scraps remained after everyone else had been provided for. "You're right," I said calmly. "I don't have children or a mortgage. I also don't have 12 years of my life back, or the career I gave up, or the relationship I sacrificed to take care of our grandfather. But apparently those things weren't worth very much." There was a pause, and when Rachel spoke again, Her voice had taken on the placating tone she used with difficult clients. Sarah, you're being dramatic. No one forced you to play nursemaid. You made that choice yourself. And now you need to live with the consequences. The word nursemaid hit like a slap. 12 years of round-the-clock care, of learning medical procedures and medication schedules, of providing comfort during the most frightening and vulnerable moments of another person's life, reduced to the dismissive term she might use for hired help. Is that really how you see what I did? I asked, genuinely curious about the depth of her callousness. I see it as you making a choice that suited your personality and circumstances, Rachel replied, warming to her theme. You were never particularly ambitious, Sarah. You always preferred staying home to taking risks. Caring for Grandpa gave you purpose and structure. In a way, he was doing you a favor by giving you something meaningful to do with your life. The psychological revisionism was stunning. In Rachel's version of events, I hadn't sacrificed my dreams to care for a sick family member. I'd stumbled into convenient work that matched my limited aspirations. My devotion hadn't been an act of love, but rather a reflection of my inability to achieve anything more significant. That's an interesting perspective, I said, setting down my coffee cup with deliberate care. Tell me, Rachel, what do you think I should do now, since I'm apparently so lacking in ambition and direction? Well, she said, clearly relieved to be moving toward practical solutions. You could look into getting your job back at the library. I'm sure they'd rehire you, especially if you explained the circumstances. You could find a nice little apartment, maybe start dating again. You're only 48. There's still time to build a normal life. A normal life. The phrase dripped with condescension, implying that my years of caregiving had been abnormal, perhaps even pathological. In Rachel's worldview, normal meant pursuing personal advancement without regard for family obligations, accumulating wealth and status symbols, and measuring success by how much you could acquire rather than how much you could give. That's thoughtful advice, I said, but I think I'll pass. What do you mean pass? Sarah, you have to do something. You can't just drift aimlessly forever. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The opening that would allow me to reveal just enough truth to shift the balance of power in our relationship. Not the whole truth, that would come later, if at all, but enough to make Rachel understand that her assumptions about my powerlessness were dangerously outdated. Actually, I've decided to start a business, I said, enjoying the way the words sounded when spoken with complete confidence. A business? Rachel's voice pitched higher with surprise. What kind of business? Sarah, you don't know anything about running a business. You've been out of the workforce for 12 years. I'm going to reopen Mitchell Hardware, I said, letting the announcement settle in the silence that followed. You're going to what? Rachel sputtered. That's impossible. The building belongs to me now, and I'm planning to sell it along with the house. You can't just decide to open a business in property you don't own. Actually, I can, I said, pulling out the brass key Grandpa had left me and turning it over in my fingers. I've already signed a 5-year lease on the building. Attorney Johnson helped me work out the details with the new owner. The confusion in Rachel's voice was palpable. What new owner? I own that building. It was part of Grandpa's estate. Check your paperwork more carefully, I suggested gently. The building was sold 3 months before Grandpa died. The proceeds went into his investment portfolio, which you inherited. But the building itself belongs to Cedar Falls Commercial Properties, LLC. This was a small lie, but a necessary one. Cedar Falls Commercial Properties, LLC, was a company I'd established 2 days earlier with Patricia Hendrick's help, using funds from the offshore account to purchase the building from Rachel's inheritance at fair market value. The transaction had been handled so smoothly that Rachel wouldn't discover the truth until she tried to include the building in her property sale. That's impossible, Rachel repeated, but I could hear uncertainty creeping into her voice. No one told me about any sale. I'm sure Attorney Johnson has all the documentation if you'd like to review it, I said. The important thing is that I'll have a place to build something meaningful. Grandpa always said the community needed a good hardware store. Sarah, this is insane. You don't have the money to start a business. You inherited $1, remember? Where exactly do you think you're going to get funding for inventory, equipment, insurance, all the things you need to run a store? This was the question I'd been anticipating, the moment when I could begin revealing the true scope of my transformation. I've secured private investment, I said truthfully. More than enough to launch the business properly. Private investment from whom? Sarah. No legitimate investor is going to fund a hardware store run by someone with no business experience and no collateral. You'd be surprised what people will invest in when they believe in the person behind the project, I replied. Some investors care more about character and commitment than traditional qualifications. Rachel was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically hear her trying to puzzle out how her powerless, directionless sister had managed to arrange financing for a business venture. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted from dismissive to calculating. How much investment are we talking about? Enough, I said simply. Sarah, that's not an answer. If you're serious about this, and I'm not saying I think you should be, you need to be realistic about the financial requirements. A hardware store requires significant startup capital, ongoing operational funds, and reserves for unexpected expenses. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'm aware of the financial requirements, I said, allowing a note of steel to enter my voice. I've done my research. With what money? Rachel pressed. You can't get a business loan without collateral, and you can't get private investment without a solid business plan and financial projections. This whole idea is a fantasy. Is it? I asked. Well, I suppose you'll find out when Mitchell Hardware reopens next month. The silence stretched between us, filled with Rachel's growing realization that something fundamental had changed in our dynamic. For the first time in our adult lives, I was speaking to her as an equal rather than a supplicant, making plans that didn't require her approval or assistance. Sarah, she said finally, her voice taking on the careful tone she used when cross-examining hostile witnesses. What aren't you telling me? I'm not sure what you mean. Something is different about you. This whole conversation, you're not acting like yourself. Where are you getting this confidence? Where is this money really coming from? I stood up from the kitchen island and walked to the window, watching the cardinal that had made itself at home at my bird feeder. Maybe this is who I've always been underneath. Maybe 12 years of putting everyone else first just made me forget. That's not an answer either, Rachel said sharply. I want to know exactly what's going on. Are you borrowing money you can't afford to pay back? Are you making decisions based on some kind of emotional breakdown? Because if you are, Mom and I need to intervene before you destroy your financial future. The assumption that my newfound independence must be evidence of mental instability was so perfectly Rachel that I almost laughed. In her world, people like me didn't suddenly develop backbone or business ambitions. We remained grateful for whatever scraps we received, and certainly didn't challenge the established family hierarchy. I appreciate your concern, I said, but my mental health and financial decisions are my responsibility now. Now? What do you mean now? When weren't they your responsibility? This was dangerous territory, approaching truths I wasn't ready to reveal. I mean now that I'm no longer caring for Grandpa. Now that I have time to focus on my own goals instead of everyone else's needs. Sarah, listen to me, Rachel said, her voice taking on the urgency she typically reserved for closing arguments. I don't know what kind of scheme someone has sold you on, but legitimate business opportunities don't fall into the laps of middle-aged women with no experience and no assets. If someone is promising you easy money or guaranteed returns, they're lying. No one promised me anything easy, I replied. This is going to be hard work. But it's work I choose to do for myself instead of work I do because someone else expects it. You're not making sense, Rachel said, frustration bleeding through her professional composure. People can't just reinvent themselves overnight. You can't just decide to become a businesswoman because you're upset about an inheritance. Can't I asked. What exactly is stopping me? Reality, Rachel snapped. Financial reality, practical reality, the reality that you've been out of the workforce for 12 years and you have no idea how the modern business world operates. Those are certainly challenges, I agreed. But they're not insurmountable obstacles. People overcome much bigger disadvantages than mine every day. Not people like you, Rachel said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The silence that followed was deafening. In those 4 words, Rachel had revealed exactly what she thought of me, exactly how she'd always seen me. Not people like me, meaning not people who were content to sacrifice, to serve, to remain quietly in the background while others pursued ambition and achievement. What exactly do you mean by people like me? I asked quietly. Rachel tried to backtrack, realizing she'd gone too far. I just meant people who haven't been in the business world recently. I didn't mean anything personal. Yes, you did, I said calmly. You meant people who lack ambition. People who are satisfied with small lives. People who don't have what it takes to build something significant. That's how you've always seen me, isn't it? Sarah, that's not... It's exactly what you meant, I interrupted. And you know what? You're right about one thing. People like the person I used to be don't usually reinvent themselves overnight. But maybe I was never actually that person. Maybe I was just playing a role that everyone expected me to play. I don't understand what you're talking about. I'm talking about the difference between choosing sacrifice and having sacrifice chosen for you. I'm talking about the difference between being valued for who you are and being valued for what you provide. I'm talking about discovering that the people you love most are the ones who see you least clearly. Rachel was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost its sharp edge. Sarah, you're scaring me. This doesn't sound like you at all. Maybe it's exactly like me, I said. Maybe you just never bothered to look closely enough to see who I really was. That's not fair. I love you, Sarah. We're family. Are we? I asked. Because family members don't usually laugh when someone they love is humiliated. Family members don't dismiss 12 years of devoted service as if it were a hobby. Family members don't assume that one person's dreams matter less than another person's convenience. The will reading was, I'm sorry about that. I was surprised, and I reacted badly, but that doesn't mean I don't care about you. When was the last time you asked how I was doing? I said. Not whether I needed anything, not whether Grandpa was okay, but how I was doing. When was the last time you were interested in my thoughts or feelings or dreams that didn't involve caring for someone else? Rachel was quiet for a long time. I don't know. Neither do I said, and that tells us everything we need to know about what kind of family we really are. So what happens now? Rachel asked, her voice smaller than I'd heard it since we were children. Now you go back to Denver and your successful life and your beautiful family, and you stop worrying about what your strange sister is doing in Cedar Falls. Now you sell the house and invest the money and forget that you ever had to think about anyone else's inconvenient needs. And what about you? I build something, I said, looking out at the bird feeder where the cardinal had been joined by his mate. I create something that matters to me, something that serves the community Grandpa loved. I discover what it feels like to make decisions based on my own judgment instead of other people's expectations. Sarah, Rachel said, and for the first time in the conversation, she sounded genuinely vulnerable. I know I haven't been a good sister. I know I took you for granted. But I don't want to lose you completely. You're not losing me, I said gently. You're just not controlling me anymore. There's a difference. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen island for a long time, processing the conversation and what it meant for my relationship with my family. I felt no anger, no desire for revenge, no need to inflict pain in return for the pain I'd received. What I felt was something much more powerful, complete freedom from the need for their approval or understanding. 3 weeks later, Mitchell Hardware reopened with a community celebration that drew half the town. The store was everything Grandpa would have wanted. Well-stocked, fairly priced, and staffed by people who understood that customer service meant treating everyone with respect and kindness. I hired 2 full-time employees and 3 part-timers, all of them people who needed second chances or first opportunities. Mrs. Henderson, my former neighbor, brought cookies for the grand opening and told me how proud Grandpa would have been. David Chen sent a congratulations card from Portland, where he was apparently thriving as a department head at his private school. Attorney Johnson stopped by to pick up some gardening supplies and winked when he handed me his credit card. Rachel and Mom did not attend the reopening, though they sent a flower arrangement with a card that read, "Wishing you success in your new venture." The flowers were beautiful, but they felt like a peace offering from people who still didn't understand what they were apologizing for. The store was profitable within its first month, but profitability wasn't the point. The point was the satisfaction of building something meaningful, of creating jobs for people who needed them, of serving a community that had supported me through the hardest years of my life. The point was discovering that I was capable of much more than anyone, including myself, had ever imagined. 6 months after the reopening, I received a phone call from Patricia Hendricks with an update on the offshore investment account. The balance had grown to just over $2.4 million, and she wanted to discuss diversification strategies and long-term financial planning. I scheduled the appointment, but I wasn't particularly interested in accumulating more wealth. I had enough money to live comfortably, to run my business, and to be generous with causes that mattered to me. What I treasured more than the money was the knowledge that Grandpa Robert had seen my true worth when no one else could. He'd understood that love expressed through service deserved recognition and reward, that sacrifice shouldn't be taken for granted, and that sometimes the people who give the most receive the least acknowledgement. His elaborate plan hadn't just been about ensuring my financial security. It had been about validating my value as a human being, independent of my usefulness to others. The offshore account was proof that someone had witnessed my devotion and deemed it worthy of the highest honor he could bestow. I never told Rachel or Mom about the inheritance. They assumed my business success came from some combination of luck, borrowed money, and beginner's fortune. I let them believe whatever made them comfortable, because their understanding was no longer necessary for my peace of mind. Sometimes Rachel would call to check on me, and our conversations were cordial but distant. She'd update me on her children's achievements and her career milestones, and I'd share news about the store and the community. We were polite strangers who happened to share DNA and childhood memories, nothing more. Mom visited once, ostensibly to see the store but really to assess whether my new life represented some kind of criticism of her parenting choices. She bought a small potted plant and complimented the store's organization, but I could see her calculating how much money I must be spending on rent and inventory, and wondering where it was all coming from. "You seem happy," she said as she prepared to leave. "I am," I replied, and meant it completely. "Your grandfather would be proud," she added, though I wasn't sure she understood why. "Yes," I agreed. "He would be." That evening, I sat on the front porch of my rented house with a cup of tea and Grandpa's old journal, writing about the day's events and planning for the future. The cardinal pair had built a nest in the oak tree near my bird feeder, and I could hear their evening songs as the sun set behind the hills that surrounded Cedar Falls. In the distance, I could see the lights coming on in the house on Maple Street, where new owners were probably settling in for the night. Rachel had sold the property quickly and for a good price, using the proceeds to buy a larger house in an even more prestigious Denver neighborhood. I felt no nostalgia for the life I'd left behind, no regret for the family relationships that had proven too shallow to survive my transformation from servant to equal. What I felt was gratitude for Grandpa's wisdom, for Patricia Hendricks' guidance, for Attorney Johnson's discretion, and most of all for the opportunity to discover who I really was when freed from other people's expectations. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and I could smell the honeysuckle that grew wild along my back fence. Tomorrow would bring new customers to serve, new challenges to navigate, new opportunities to build something meaningful. For the first time in my adult life, tomorrow belonged entirely to me. I closed the journal and went inside to plan the next day's work, carrying with me the knowledge that sometimes the most valuable gifts come disguised as endings, and that the courage to walk away from one story is often the key to beginning another. 2 years into running Mitchell Hardware, I received an unexpected visitor on a humid Thursday afternoon in July. The bell above the front door chimed, and I looked up from the inventory spreadsheet I'd been reviewing to see Rachel standing in the entrance, looking around the store with barely concealed amazement. She'd driven down from Denver without warning, something she'd never done in all the years I'd lived in Cedar Falls. Her usual polished appearance was slightly wilted from the summer heat, and she carried herself with the careful posture of someone trying to appear casual while feeling completely out of place. "Sarah," she said, approaching the counter where I stood. I was in the area for a client meeting and thought I'd stop by to see how things are going. I knew she was lying. Rachel's law firm specialized in corporate mergers, and there weren't any corporations in Cedar Falls worth merging. But I appreciated the effort to maintain civility, even if it was built on fiction. Rachel, what a surprise, I said, setting down my pen and giving her my full attention. How was your drive? Long, she admitted, glancing around at the well-organized shelves and the steady stream of customers browsing the aisles. I'd forgotten how far it is from the interstate to downtown. An elderly man approached the counter with a bag of grass seed and a bottle of fertilizer, and I rang up his purchase while Rachel watched the transaction with the intense focus of someone trying to solve a puzzle. After the customer left, she stepped closer to the counter. The store looks incredible, she said, and I could hear genuine surprise in her voice. It's so much bigger than I remembered Grandpa's place being. I expanded into the adjacent storefront, I explained. The flower shop next door went out of business, and the landlord offered me a good deal on combining the spaces. This was true, though I'd left out the detail that I was the landlord. Cedar Falls Commercial Properties, LLC, had purchased 3 buildings on this block, and I'd been quietly revitalizing the entire stretch of downtown. The flower shop space now housed an expanded garden center, while the former insurance office on the other side had become a small cafe that stayed open late for the convenience of working people. Rachel walked through the store slowly, taking in the modern point-of-sale system, the clearly marked aisles, and the small seating area near the garden center, where customers could wait while their orders were filled. Everything was clean, efficient, and obviously profitable. You have employees, she observed, watching one of my part-time workers help a young mother load mulch into her car. 5 full-time and 4 part-time, I said. We're busy enough to justify the staffing, especially during spring and summer. That's a lot of payroll for a small-town hardware store. It's a lot of payroll for a small-town hardware store that's only serving Cedar Falls. I agreed. But we deliver to 6 surrounding communities, and we've built up a significant online presence for specialty items. Rachel's expression shifted to something between confusion and calculation. Online presence? Sarah, when did you learn about e-commerce and digital marketing? When I needed to, I said simply. It turns out I'm capable of learning new things when I have the motivation and the time. She continued her tour of the store, pausing at the display of power tools that clearly represented a significant investment in inventory. These aren't exactly impulse purchases, she said, running her hand along a professional-grade table saw. How do you afford to stock equipment like this? The same way any business stocks inventory, I replied. Revenue from sales, reinvestment of profits, and careful financial planning. But the startup costs alone. She trailed off, clearly struggling with the mathematics of what she was seeing. Were substantial, I finished, but manageable with the right approach. Rachel turned to face me directly, her lawyer instincts fully engaged. Sarah, I need you to be honest with me. Where did the money for all this really come from? It was the question she'd been building toward since the moment she walked through the door. 2 years of wondering how her directionless sister had transformed into a successful business owner had finally driven her to make the 4-hour drive for answers. I told you, I said calmly. Private investment. From whom? She pressed. No legitimate investor would fund this kind of operation for someone with no business experience. The risk assessment alone would eliminate you from consideration. You seem very certain about what investors will and won't do, I observed. Have you been researching small business financing in your spare time? Rachel's cheeks flushed slightly. I've been curious about how you managed to do something that should have been impossible. So yes, I've done some research. And what did your research tell you? That banks don't lend to people without collateral, that private investors expect detailed business plans and market analysis, and that even with perfect credit and extensive experience, most small businesses fail within the first 2 years. All of that is true, I agreed, which is why I was very careful about who I approached for funding. Sarah, stop deflecting. I want to know exactly who gave you the money to start this business and why. The intensity in her voice reminded me of the depositions I'd occasionally observed during her visits home, when she'd describe breaking down hostile witnesses through relentless questioning. But I wasn't a hostile witness, and this wasn't a courtroom. I was a successful business owner in my own store, and she was a visitor who had arrived uninvited and demanding answers to questions that weren't her business. Why does it matter? I asked. The store is profitable, my employees are well paid, and I'm contributing to the local economy. Isn't that enough? It matters because it doesn't make sense, Rachel said, her voice rising slightly. 2 years ago, you had nothing. No money, no prospects, no skills that translated to running a business. Now you're operating what looks like a $250,000 enterprise. Money like that doesn't just appear out of nowhere. Doesn't it? I asked, allowing a small smile to play at the corners of my mouth. No, it doesn't, Rachel said firmly. And I'm starting to think you've gotten yourself involved in something illegal, or at least highly irregular. Money laundering, maybe, or some kind of financial fraud scheme. The accusation was so absurd that I laughed out loud, a sound that echoed through the store and drew curious glances from a couple browsing the painting supplies. You think I'm a criminal mastermind now? 2 years ago, I was too incompetent to manage my own life, and now I'm sophisticated enough to run a money laundering operation? I think you're desperate enough to make poor decisions, Rachel said bluntly. And I think someone has taken advantage of that desperation to involve you in something you don't fully understand. Such as? I don't know. Maybe someone needed a front for illegal income, and they picked you because you seemed compliant and naive. Maybe you're being used as a cutout for organized crime money. Maybe this whole store is just a way to legitimize funds from drug dealing or human trafficking. The theories were so fantastical that they bordered on paranoid, but I could see the genuine concern in Rachel's eyes. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She was trying to save me from what she perceived as a dangerous situation that I was too innocent to recognize. Rachel, I said gently, do you really think I'm stupid enough to get involved with organized crime? Do you really believe I'd risk everything to launder money for drug dealers? I think you're isolated enough and desperate enough to be vulnerable to manipulation, she said. And I think 12 years of caring for Grandpa didn't exactly prepare you to recognize sophisticated financial crimes. You're probably right about that, I admitted. Caring for Grandpa didn't teach me much about finance or business operations, but it did teach me something much more valuable. Which is how to recognize the difference between people who genuinely care about my welfare and people who care about controlling me. Rachel's expression shifted, and I could see her processing the implications of what I'd said. You think I'm trying to control you? I think you're trying to solve a puzzle that threatens your understanding of how the world works, I said. You need to believe that people like me don't succeed without help from people like you. You need to believe that intelligence and capability are distributed according to some cosmic hierarchy that places you near the top and me somewhere near the bottom. That's not true, Rachel protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? You've spent the last 20 minutes trying to prove that my success must be illegitimate because you can't imagine me earning it honestly. You've accused me of everything from fraud to money laundering rather than considering the possibility that you misjudged my abilities. Rachel was quiet for a moment, staring at a display of hand tools while she processed what I'd said. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller and more uncertain than I'd heard it since childhood. I'm worried about you, she said. This whole transformation happened so suddenly. People don't usually change this dramatically without some kind of external catalyst. People change when they're finally free to become who they really are, I replied. Maybe what you're seeing isn't a transformation at all. Maybe it's just the removal of constraints that were keeping me from showing my true capabilities. What constraints? The constraint of believing that my worth was measured by how much I could sacrifice for others. The constraint of thinking that love required me to always put myself last. The constraint of accepting that some people matter more than others, and that I wasn't one of the people who mattered. Rachel flinched as if I'd struck her. Sarah, I never said you didn't matter. You didn't have to say it. You demonstrated it every time you visited for 3 days, and spent 2 of them on work calls. You demonstrated it every time you assumed I'd be available to handle whatever family crisis arose. You demonstrated it when you laughed at my inheritance and told me I should be grateful for the time I'd had with Grandpa. I was surprised, Rachel said weakly. I didn't handle the situation well. You were honest, I corrected. For the first time in years, you showed me exactly how you really felt about my choices and my value. And that honesty was the greatest gift you could have given me. I don't understand. It freed me from the need to earn your approval, I explained. As long as I believed that love was conditional on service, I had to keep serving. But once I understood that no amount of service would ever be enough, I could stop trying and start living. Rachel walked to the window and stared out at the street, where afternoon shoppers were browsing the outdoor displays of seasonal plants. So what happens now? She asked without turning around. Now you go back to Denver and your successful life. And you stop worrying about how your sister is managing to thrive without your guidance or approval. And if I can't stop worrying, then you'll have to learn to live with uncertainty, I said. The same way I learned to live with the uncertainty of never knowing whether the people I loved actually valued me for who I was. Rachel turned back to face me, and I could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. I do love you, Sarah. I know I haven't always shown it well, but I do. I believe you, I said, and I meant it. But love isn't enough if it's not paired with respect. And respect means accepting that I'm capable of making my own decisions. Even decisions you don't understand or approve of. Even if those decisions might be dangerous? Even then, I confirmed. I spent 12 years protecting Grandpa from dangers he couldn't recognize or avoid. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life being protected from dangers. I'm perfectly capable of handling myself. Rachel nodded slowly, though I could see she was struggling with the concept of relinquishing her self-appointed role as my guardian and guide. Can I at least stay in touch? Can I call occasionally to see how you're doing? Of course, I said, but the calls need to be about genuine interest in my life, not about investigating my financial arrangements or trying to solve problems I haven't asked for help with. I can try to do that. Good, I said, meaning it. I'd like to have a sister who knows me as I am now, not as I used to be. After Rachel left, promising to drive safely and call when she got home, I remained at the counter, thinking about the conversation and what it revealed about how much had changed between us. 2 years ago, her suspicions and accusations would have left me devastated, desperate to explain myself and reassure her that I wasn't doing anything wrong. Today, they felt like relics from someone else's life. The bell chimed again, and Mrs. Patterson from the Methodist Church entered with her usual Thursday afternoon smile and her weekly list of small repair items. She'd been one of my first regular customers, and her steady patronage had helped establish the store's reputation for customer service and fair pricing. Sarah, dear, she said, approaching the counter with a small bag of screws and a tube of caulk. I couldn't help but notice the young woman who just left. She looked upset. My sister, I explained, ringing up her purchase. She was worried about me. Worried? Mrs. Patterson looked genuinely puzzled. Whatever for. You're the most successful business owner in town. Your store employs more people than any other single business on this street. She has concerns about how I financed the expansion, I said diplomatically. Mrs. Patterson laughed, the warm sound of someone who found other people's worries amusing rather than threatening. Well, I suppose she hasn't seen what careful saving and smart investing can accomplish over time. Your grandfather always said you had more sense than most people gave you credit for. He said that? Oh yes, many times. He used to tell anyone who'd listen that you were the smartest person in your family, just too modest to show it off. He said you understood things that other people missed because you paid attention instead of talking all the time. The casual revelation that Grandpa had spoken publicly about my intelligence and capabilities was deeply moving, especially coming from someone who had no reason to flatter or manipulate me. Mrs. Patterson was simply sharing a memory, unaware of how much her words meant to someone who'd spent years wondering if anyone saw value in her beyond her usefulness. He was very proud of you, she continued, counting out exact change for her purchase. Always talking about how you saw what needed to be done and did it without being asked. How you figured out solutions to problems that stumped everyone else. He said you were wasted on caregiving, that you should have been running something important. He never told me that. Well, of course not, Mrs. Patterson said with the practical wisdom of someone who'd lived through 8 decades of human nature. You can't tell someone they're too good for what they're doing while they're still doing it. That would just make them feel bad about their choices. But he was planning something for you. He told me so. Planning something? Oh, yes. He said he was going to make sure you had opportunities when you were ready for them. He said he was working on ensuring you'd be free to use your talents properly someday. Mrs. Patterson gathered her items and headed toward the door, then paused and turned back. You know, dear, seeing how well you've done with this store, I think he'd be very satisfied with how his plans worked out. After she left, I stood at the counter for a long time, processing what she'd shared about Grandpa's perceptions and plans. The conversation added another layer to my understanding of his elaborate inheritance scheme. He hadn't just been testing my family's character, he'd been preparing for my eventual liberation from a role that, despite its importance, had been limiting my potential. The offshore account wasn't just compensation for past service, it was investment capital for future achievement. He'd seen capabilities in me that I'd barely recognized in myself, and he'd worked to ensure I'd have the resources to develop them when the time was right. That evening, I called Patricia Hendricks to discuss expanding my business investments beyond the hardware store. The trust account had grown to nearly $3 million, and I was ready to start using that wealth to create opportunities for other people who needed second chances or first breaks. I'm thinking about a small business incubator program, I explained to Patricia during our video call. Something that provides both funding and mentorship for people who have good ideas but limited access to traditional financing. That's an excellent use of charitable funds, Patricia replied, making notes on her tablet. Are you thinking about focusing on specific types of businesses or specific demographics? People who've been overlooked by traditional systems, I said. Single mothers trying to start home-based businesses, older workers who've been displaced by economic changes, young people from families that can't afford to support their entrepreneurial dreams. People like you were, Patricia observed with a knowing smile. Exactly like I was, I agreed. People who have the intelligence and determination to succeed, but lack the financial resources or family support to take risks. We spent an hour discussing the legal and practical aspects of establishing such a program, from tax implications, to selection criteria, to ongoing oversight requirements. By the end of the call, I had a clear roadmap for creating something that would extend Grandpa's vision of justice and opportunity beyond my own life. 6 months later, the Mitchell Foundation awarded its first grants to 5 local entrepreneurs: a former teacher starting an educational consulting business, a retired mechanic opening a specialty auto repair shop, a young single mother launching a catering service, an immigrant family starting a translation and document service, and a military veteran creating a landscaping company that specialized in accessible garden design. The grant ceremony was held in the community room of the Cedar Falls Library, with Mayor Thompson offering remarks about the importance of supporting local enterprise. Attorney Johnson attended, though he said little beyond congratulating me on the foundation's launch. Mrs. Patterson brought cookies and stayed to chat with each of the grant recipients about their business plans. Rachel called the night after the ceremony, having seen a brief article about it in the Cedar Falls Weekly newspaper's online edition. I read about your foundation, she said, her voice carefully neutral. It sounds like a wonderful program. Thank you, I replied, equally careful not to reveal too much enthusiasm. It feels good to be able to help people pursue their dreams. The article mentioned significant funding for the grants. How were you able to establish an endowment large enough to support multiple businesses? The same way I was able to establish the hardware store, I said. Careful planning and good financial advice. Rachel was quiet for a moment, and I could practically hear her mental calculations. Sarah, the numbers don't add up. Even if your store is wildly profitable, you couldn't have generated enough surplus income in 2 years to fund what the article describes as, quote, substantial grants to 5 different businesses. The article might have exaggerated the amounts, I suggested. Or you might be minimizing them, Rachel countered. just like you've been minimizing everything else about your financial situation. Does it matter? I asked. The foundation is helping people start legitimate businesses. The store is contributing to the local economy. I'm paying taxes on everything and employing people who need jobs. Isn't that enough? It's enough if it's legal and sustainable, Rachel said. But I'm starting to think there's something you're not telling me about where this money is really coming from. There are lots of things I'm not telling you, I admitted. Just like there are lots of things you don't tell me about your life in Denver. Privacy isn't the same thing as deception. Sarah, if you're in some kind of trouble, financial trouble, legal trouble, any kind of trouble, I want to help. But I can't help if you won't tell me what's really going on. The offer was genuine, and I appreciated the concern behind it. But Rachel's definition of help still involved taking control of situations she didn't understand, and I no longer needed that kind of assistance. I'm not in trouble, I said firmly. I'm exactly where I want to be, doing exactly what I choose to do, with resources I've acquired through perfectly legal means. You're gonna have to trust me on that. Trust you, Rachel repeated, as if the concept required translation. After 12 years of watching you avoid making any significant decisions, you want me to trust that you've suddenly become capable of managing complex financial arrangements? After 12 years of managing someone else's medical care, legal affairs, and daily needs while running a household and maintaining family relationships, you should trust that I'm capable of managing my own financial arrangements, I corrected. The distinction seemed to register with her, and when she spoke again, her tone was more thoughtful than accusatory. I never looked at it that way, she said slowly. I know you didn't, I replied. That's why it took me so long to look at it that way myself. We talked for a few more minutes about neutral topics. Her children's school activities, the weather in Denver, my plans for the store's autumn inventory. But underneath the pleasant conversation, I could sense Rachel's continuing struggle to reconcile the sister she remembered with the woman I'd become. After we hung up, I walked through my house, turning off lights and checking locks, following the same evening routine I'd developed over the past 2 years of independent living. The house was quiet and peaceful, filled with furniture I'd chosen and books I'd selected and plants I'd managed to keep alive through careful attention. In my bedroom, I opened the drawer of my nightstand and pulled out Grandpa's leather journal, now filled with entries documenting my transformation from caregiver to business owner to community leader. The final pages contained plans for the foundation's expansion, ideas for additional businesses I might start, and dreams for travel and education that had been deferred for so long I'd almost forgotten they existed. At the very back of the journal, tucked between the last written page and the back cover, I kept the original letter from Grandpa explaining his inheritance plan. I read it occasionally, not because I needed reminding of his love and faith in me, but because it served as proof that transformation was possible even when it seemed impossible. The letter's final paragraph had become something of a personal mission statement. You have spent 12 years proving that love doesn't require reciprocity. Now I want you to spend the next 12 years discovering what it feels like to be truly free. I was 4 years into that 12-year journey, and the freedom he'd envisioned was more expansive and fulfilling than I'd ever imagined possible. Not just freedom from family obligations, but freedom to define success on my own terms, to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than need, and to use my resources in ways that created opportunities for others who'd been overlooked or underestimated. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new possibilities. The foundation had grant applications to review, the store had autumn inventory to plan, and there were 3 more buildings on downtown's Main Street that could be renovated and returned to productive use. None of it was work I had to do. All of it was work I chose to do because it aligned with my values and utilized my capabilities. As I closed the journal and prepared for sleep, I felt the deep satisfaction of someone who discovered their true purpose not in service to others' expectations, but in the pursuit of their own authentic dreams. Grandpa's final gift hadn't just been financial security. It had been the proof that I mattered enough to be seen clearly, valued honestly, and trusted completely with the responsibility of determining my own future. The offshore account that had once seemed like an impossible fantasy had become the foundation for a life that exceeded my wildest hopes. And the best part was knowing that this was just the beginning. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October, 5 years after Grandpa's death. I was reviewing applications for the Foundation's third round of grants when my phone buzzed with Mom's number. She rarely called anymore, our conversations having dwindled to holiday check-ins and brief exchanges about weather and health. Her voice was shaky when I answered, carrying a tremor I'd never heard before. "Sarah, it's your mother. I need to tell you something important." She paused, and I could hear her struggling to find the right words. "I'm not well, sweetheart. The doctors found something during my routine mammogram last month." The word cancer hung unspoken between us, but its presence was unmistakable in her careful phrasing and hesitant tone. I set down my pen and gave her my complete attention, feeling the familiar weight of family medical crisis settling on my shoulders. "What did they find, Mom?" I asked gently. "Masses in both breasts," she said, her voice becoming steadier as she moved into the practical details. "They'll need to do surgery, probably followed by chemotherapy. The oncologist says the prognosis is good if we catch it early, but the treatment will be intensive." I found myself automatically calculating logistics, appointment schedules, recovery time, the modifications that would need to be made to her house for post-surgical care. Then I caught myself and consciously stopped. This wasn't my crisis to manage unless I chose to make it mine. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, meaning it sincerely. "What kind of support system do you have in place?" The question seemed to surprise her. "Support system?" "Friends who can help with transportation, neighbors who can check on you, family members who can assist with daily tasks during recovery. People you can rely on." "Well," she said slowly, "I was hoping. I thought perhaps you might." She trailed off, unable to complete the request directly. The old mom would have simply announced that I was needed and expected me to rearrange my life accordingly. This version seemed uncertain about whether such expectations were still reasonable. "You were hoping I might what?" I prompted, though I already knew what she was asking. "Perhaps you could stay with me for a few weeks after the surgery, just until I'm back on my feet." Rachel looked into hiring professional help, but the cost is astronomical, and I'd be more comfortable with family. There it was, the assumption that I would once again sacrifice my life to provide free caregiving services, while Rachel contributed financial research from a safe distance. The familiar pattern was so deeply ingrained that Mom seemed genuinely puzzled by my failure to immediately agree. "Have you discussed this with Rachel?" I asked. "She's very busy with work and the children," Mom replied quickly. "Brian just got promoted, and they're looking at buying a bigger house. It's not a good time for her to take on additional responsibilities." The casual dismissal of my own responsibilities was breathtaking in its presumption. As if running a successful business, managing a charitable foundation, and serving on 3 community boards constituted leisure activities that could be easily set aside whenever family need arose. "And you think it's a good time for me to take on additional responsibilities?" I asked. "Well, you're more flexible," she said, the phrase loaded with assumptions about the relative importance of our respective commitments. "Your business practically runs itself now, doesn't it?" The comment revealed how little she understood about what I'd built or how it operated. In her mind, success meant having enough money to delegate everything to other people, not understanding that meaningful work often required personal involvement and decision-making that couldn't be outsourced. "Mom," I said carefully, "I'm not going to be able to provide full-time caregiving during your recovery." The silence that followed was profound. "What do you mean?" she asked finally. "I mean that I have commitments I can't abandon, just as Rachel does. I can visit regularly, I can help coordinate professional services, and I can provide emotional support. But I can't move back into a caregiving role. But who will take care of me?" The question was plaintive, almost childlike in its helplessness. "Professional caregivers," I said firmly. "People who are trained in post-surgical care, and who can provide better medical support than I could. People whose job it is to help you recover safely." "I can't afford that kind of help for weeks on end," she protested. "Then Rachel will need to contribute financially, or you'll need to explore other options. Medicare covers some in-home care, and there are programs for seniors that provide additional support." "Sarah, I'm your mother," she said, her voice taking on a tone of wounded dignity. "After everything I've done for you, don't you think you owe me some consideration? The appeal to guilt and obligation was so automatic that I doubted she even realized she was making it. In her worldview, family relationships operated on a system of debits and credits, with children eternally indebted to parents for the basic care they'd received during childhood. "What have you done for me, Mom?" I asked quietly. The question seemed to stun her. "I raised you," she said, as if the answer were obvious. "I fed you, and clothed you, and made sure you had everything you needed. That's what parents are supposed to do," I replied. "Those are basic responsibilities, not extraordinary sacrifices that create lifelong obligations." "I don't understand this attitude," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You used to be such a caring person, so willing to help when family needed you. This selfishness isn't like you." "You're right," I agreed. "It isn't like the person I used to be. The person I used to be believed that my worth was measured by how much I could sacrifice for others. The person I am now understands that love doesn't require martyrdom. So you're just going to abandon me when I need you most?" "I'm going to maintain appropriate boundaries while offering reasonable support," I corrected. "I'll visit you in the hospital after surgery. I'll call to check on you during recovery. I'll help research the best care options and coordinate services if you need assistance with that. But I won't move back into a caregiving role that compromises my own life and work." Mom was quiet for a long time, and when she spoke again, her voice was small and uncertain. "I don't know how to handle this without you." The admission was more honest than anything she'd said during our conversation, and it touched something in me that guilt and obligation had failed to reach. "You'll figure it out," I said gently. "You're stronger and more capable than you give yourself credit for. What if I'm not? Then you'll learn to be, the same way I did." After we hung up, I sat in my office at the foundation, thinking about the conversation and what it revealed about how much had changed in our family dynamics. 5 years ago, Mom's cancer diagnosis would have sent me into immediate crisis mode, calculating how to manage her care while maintaining some semblance of my own life. Today, I felt sympathy for her situation, but no compulsion to solve it for her. The difference wasn't callousness. It was clarity about the distinction between caring about someone and being responsible for managing their problems. I could love my mother without sacrificing my autonomy to her needs, just as I could support her without enabling her dependence on others to handle life's challenges. 2 days later, Rachel called with her own perspective on Mom's situation. "She told me about your conversation," she said without preamble. "I can't believe you're refusing to help her during cancer treatment." "I'm not refusing to help," I said calmly. "I'm refusing to provide full-time caregiving services. There's a difference. Sarah, she's 73 years old and facing major surgery. She needs someone who cares about her, not some stranger from a nursing agency. She needs competent medical care during recovery," I corrected. "Professional caregivers are better equipped to provide that than I am." "But you took care of Grandpa for 12 years, Rachel protested. "You know how to manage medical needs and recovery processes." "I learned those skills because there wasn't anyone else available to learn them," I said. "This situation is different. There are alternatives to family caregiving, and I think Mom should explore them." "Those alternatives cost money," Rachel said bluntly. "Mom's insurance won't cover everything, and the out-of-pocket expenses could be significant." "Then you'll need to help with those expenses," I replied. "I can contribute some money," Rachel said carefully, "but I can't cover weeks of professional care. My own expenses are pretty high right now, with the new house and Tyler's college fund." The assumption that my financial contribution would be unnecessary because my labor would be free was so casual that I wondered if Rachel even realized she'd made it. In her calculations, my time and energy had no monetary value, while her money was too precious to spend on something that could be obtained for free through family obligation. "Have you considered taking time off work to provide care yourself?" I asked. "That's not really practical," Rachel said quickly. "I'm in the middle of a major case and my clients depend on me. I can't just abandon my professional responsibilities." "But I can abandon mine?" "Your situation is different," she said, echoing Mom's earlier sentiment. "You have more flexibility." "I have exactly the same flexibility you do," I corrected. "The difference is that I'm choosing not to use it to enable Mom's helplessness." "Helplessness?" Rachel's voice sharpened. "Sarah, She has cancer. She's not being helpless. She's facing a serious medical crisis. She's facing a medical crisis that thousands of people navigate successfully every year using professional care services and family support networks that don't require anyone to sacrifice their livelihood, I said. Mom's situation isn't unique and it doesn't require unique solutions. So what are you suggesting? That we just let her figure it out on her own? I'm suggesting that we help her access appropriate resources while maintaining our own boundaries, I said. I'm suggesting that we treat her like a capable adult who can learn to manage challenges with proper support, rather than like a helpless child who needs someone else to handle her problems. Rachel was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her processing this perspective. When did you become so hard? She asked finally. When I learned the difference between helping someone and enabling them, I replied. When I discovered that the people who claim to need me most are often the ones who respect me least. That's not fair. Mom respects you. Does she? Because respect involves acknowledging that my time and commitments have value, that my decisions deserve consideration, and that my well-being matters as much as hers. I haven't seen much evidence of that kind of respect. Rachel sighed, the sound of someone who was beginning to understand an argument she didn't want to accept. So what happens now? Do we just let her hire strangers and hope for the best? We help her research quality care providers, we visit regularly to ensure she's receiving good treatment, and we provide emotional support during a frightening time, I said. We act like loving family members who want the best outcome for everyone involved, including ourselves. And if she can't afford professional care, then you and I contribute financially to ensure she gets what she needs. We treat this like a family expense that requires shared responsibility rather than a family crisis that requires one person's complete sacrifice. The conversation ended with Rachel agreeing to research care options and divide the costs with me, though I could tell she was still struggling with the idea that Mom's needs didn't automatically supersede everyone else's concerns. It was a shift in family dynamics that challenged decades of established patterns. And change was never comfortable for people who'd benefited from the old arrangements. 3 weeks later, Mom had her surgery at Cedar Falls General Hospital. I visited her every day during her 4-day stay, bringing flowers and magazines and sitting with her during the long afternoons when she was too groggy to do more than doze fitfully. Rachel flew in for the surgery itself, staying 2 days to ensure everything went smoothly before returning to Denver and her work commitments. The professional caregiver we'd hired, a middle-aged woman named Janet, who specialized in post-surgical recovery, was everything Mom needed: competent, patient, and experienced with the specific challenges of cancer treatment. She managed medication schedules with precision, monitored incision sites for signs of infection, and provided the kind of skilled care that would have been impossible for an untrained family member to deliver safely. Mom adjusted to the arrangement more easily than I'd expected, perhaps because Janet's professional demeanor made it clear that caregiving was her job, rather than an expression of family obligation. There were no guilt trips about inconvenience, no emotional manipulation about sacrifice, just straightforward medical support, delivered with kindness and expertise. I visited 3 times a week during Mom's recovery, bringing groceries and handling errands that Janet couldn't manage, while maintaining her focus on medical care. The visits were pleasant and purposeful, free of the resentment and exhaustion that had characterized my caregiving years with Grandpa. The difference was choice. I was choosing to help within boundaries I'd established, contributing time and energy I could afford to give without compromising my own life and work. Mom was receiving better care than I could have provided, and everyone involved understood their roles and responsibilities clearly. 6 months later, Mom's follow-up tests showed no sign of remaining cancer. Her recovery had been textbook perfect, aided by professional care that had prevented the complications that sometimes arose when well-meaning but untrained family members tried to manage complex medical needs. "I owe you an apology," she said during one of my regular visits, as we sat on her front porch drinking iced tea and watching her neighbor's grandchildren play in the yard across the street. "For what?" I asked. "For assuming you drop everything to take care of me," she said slowly. "For not understanding that you have a life that matters just as much as mine does." The acknowledgement was more than I'd expected, and more meaningful than elaborate apologies would have been. It represented recognition of my autonomy and value as an individual, rather than just a family resource to be deployed when needed. Thank you, I said simply. Janet told me something interesting, Mom continued. She said that family caregiving often isn't the best option for serious medical situations. She said that emotional relationships can interfere with the kind of objective care that patients need for optimal recovery. She's probably right about that. She said that the families who do best are the ones who provide love and support while letting professionals handle the medical care. She said trying to do everything yourself usually means doing nothing particularly well. I nodded, recognizing the wisdom in Janet's professional experience. How do you feel about that? Relieved, actually, Mom admitted. I spent weeks worrying about being a burden to you, about disrupting your life the way Grandpa's illness disrupted it. When you said you couldn't do it, I was hurt at first. But then I realized you were protecting both of us from a situation that wouldn't have been good for either one of us. The insight surprised me with its depth and accuracy. Mom had always been more perceptive than I'd given her credit for. Perhaps because I'd been too focused on managing her expectations to pay attention to her actual understanding of family dynamics. I'm proud of what you've built here, she said, gesturing toward downtown Cedar Falls, where the hardware store's sign was visible among the revitalized businesses that lined Main Street. I'm proud that you found a way to honor Grandpa's memory while creating something entirely your own. He would have been pleased, I agreed. He would have been amazed, Mom corrected. He knew you were capable of great things, but I don't think even he imagined you'd become such a force for good in this community. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the evening light fade behind the trees that lined her quiet street. The conversation had felt like a conclusion to years of misunderstanding and mismatched expectations, a recognition that love could exist without obligation, and that family relationships were strongest when they honored everyone's autonomy and dignity. As I drove home that evening past the foundation offices where grant recipients were building their dreams with support that had once seemed impossible, I felt the deep satisfaction of someone who'd learned to live authentically while honoring the best parts of her history. Grandpa's gift had been more than money. It had been permission to become fully myself, and the resources to use that authenticity in service of something larger than personal comfort. The offshore account that had once seemed like a miracle had become simply one tool among many for building a life of purpose and meaning. But the real treasure had been discovering that I was worthy of being seen clearly, valued honestly, and trusted completely with the responsibility of determining my own future. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.